So, good evening, ma'am. For tonight, I will discuss about martial law challenge to democracy, Article 8, the National Assembly. So, this article we have 20 sections, and the section 1 and 2 talks about composition and representation. So, the legislative power is vested in National Assembly, composed of representatives from provinces, districts, and cities. Apportioned according to population, each district should consist of contiguous, compact, and adjacent territories, with each existing district or province having at least one member. So, the section 3 talks about election and term of members. So members are elected by qualified voters for a 6-year term. In case of dissolution, newly elected members serve the remaining term starting from when the Prime Minister convenes the Assembly. So the section 4 talks about qualifications. To be a member, one must be a natural born Filipino citizen, at least 25 years old, literate, a registered voter in the district, and resident for at least 1 year prior of the election. So the section 5 talks about election and vacancies. Elections are held every 6 years on the second Monday of May. If a vacancy occurs more than a year before a regular election, a special election is held within 60 days. So, in section 6, it talks about sessions. Okay. The National Assembly meets one a year, beginning on the fourth Monday of July. It may recess but may be convened by the Prime Minister to address specific matters. So the section 7 talks about organization and rules. So the National Assembly elects Speaker and other officers. A majority of members is needed to conduct business and set their own rules, so including penalties for disorderly conduct. So, Section 8, compensation and transparency. So, members receive a set annual salary, with the Speaker earning more. National Assembly records and accounts are open to public scrutiny and audited annually. So the section 9 talks about privileges and immunities. So members have immunity from arrest for offenses punishable by up to 6 years of imprisonment while attending sessions, with the specific conditions for surrendering them after a session ends. So section 10 and 11 talks about restrictions. So members cannot hold other government positions, receive certain appointments, or be involved in government contracts during the tenure. They also cannot represent clients in specific cases involving the government. So the section 12 talks about question hour and inquiries. A monthly question hour is held where the Prime Minister or ministers must answer members' questions. So, the Assembly and its committees can conduct inquiries for legislative purpose, respecting the rights of those involved. So, the Section 13 talks about confidence in the Prime Minister. The National Assembly can withdraw confidence from the Prime Minister by electing successor. The Prime Minister may also advise the President to involve the Assembly calling for elections within a set of time frame. So the section is 40 talks about treaty and war powers. The National Assembly must approve treaties by majority vote and can declare a state of war by two-thirds majority. In section 15 talks about emergency powers. So during national emergencies, the Assembly may authorize the Prime Minister to exercise certain powers for a limited period to implement national policies. So in section 16, it talks about budget and appropriations. So the Prime Minister submits a budget each year, and the National Assembly must approve the General Appropriation Bill. Social appropriation bills must specify their purpose, and no law can authorize the transfer of appropriations without restrictions. So the section 17 talks about taxation. So taxation must be uniform and equitable. So the Assembly may authorize the Prime Minister to set tariff rates and other duties, and certain religious and charitable organizations are exempt from taxes. So section 18 talks about appropriations and use of the public funds. So money can only be paid out of the treasury if authorized by law. Public funds cannot be used to support religious institutions except under specific conditions. So in section 19 and 20 talks about legislative process. So bills must pass free readings on separate days and be distributed in final form to members before passage. The Prime Minister may veto a bill, but the Assembly can override this veto with a two-thirds majority. The Prime Minister also has veto power over specific items in appropriation, revenue, or tariff bills. So that's this Article 8. So now let's proceed to Article 9, the Prime Minister and the Cabinet. And so in this article, we have 16 sections. So the first one is executive power. So the minister with the cabinet exercises executive power in government. The cabinet consists of ministry heads as determined by law, with the prime minister as the head of government. So the section 2, the accountability. The Prime Minister and Cabinet are responsible to the National Assembly for the government's program and national policy. So the Section 3 talks about election of the Prime Minister. The Prime Minister is elected by a majority vote from the members of the National Assembly. So the Section 4 talks about appointment of the Cabinet. The Prime Minister appoints the Cabinet members or the ministry heads with at least a majority of them coming from the National Assembly. Cabinet members serve as the discretion of the Prime Minister. So the Section 5 talks about Deputy Prime Minister and Deputy Ministers. So the Prime Minister appoints the Deputy Prime Minister from the National Assembly who heads the minister and perform tasks assigned by the Prime Minister. Deputy Minister are also appointed and perform duties as per law or their ministry heads. Section 6 talks about oath of office. The Prime Minister and Cabinet members take an oath or affirmation to faithfully execute their duties and serve the nation. The Section 7 talks about salaries. The salaries and benefits of the Prime Minister and the Cabinet members are fixed by law and cannot be changed during the tenure. So the Prime Minister's salary is initially the same as that the President. So the Section 8 it talks about restrictions on members. The Prime Minister and the Cabinet members are subject to restrictions such as not appearing or as counsel in court, managing businesses, or practicing professions. So the Section 9 talks about designation. The The Prime Minister or cabinet members may resign for any reason without vacating their seat in the National Assembly. Section 10 talks about government program. The Prime Minister presents the government's program and recommends measures to the National Assembly at the start of each regular session and as needed thereafter. So, the Section 11, control over ministries. The Prime Minister has control over all ministries in the government. So, the Section 12 talks about Commander-in-Chief powers. The Prime Minister is the Commander-in-Chief of the armed forces and may call upon them to address lawless violence, invasion, insurrection, or rebellion. In cases of rebellion, national emergency, the Prime Minister may suspend habeas corpus or declared martial law. So, Section 13, appointments. The Prime Minister appoints head of officers in the armed forces from brigadier general or commodore and the other government officers. The National Assembly can also assign appointment powers to the other officials. So now, the Section 14 talks about pardons and amnesty. So the Prime Minister has the authority to grant reprieves, imitations, pardons, and remit fines. With the National Assembly approval, the Prime Minister can grant amnesty. So the Section 15 talks about the loans. The Prime Minister can contract or guarantee foreign and domestic loans on behalf of the Philippines within limits set by law. So now the last section, the Section 16, talks about transfer or powers. Powers previously vested in the President are not addressed in this Constitution or transferred to the Prime Minister unless the National Assembly decides otherwise. So now, let's proceed to Article 10, talks about the judiciary. We have 12 sections of this article. So the first section talks about judicial power. The judicial powers is vested in one Supreme Court and inferior court as defined by law. The Batasang Pambansa has the authority to define the assigned jurisdiction to various courts, but it cannot remove the Supreme Court's jurisdiction over specific cases. So the Section 2 talks about composition of the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court consists of a Chief Justice and 14 Associate Justices. It can sit either in bank or in two divisions. Cases involving the constitutionality or treaties, executive agreements of laws must be heard in bank with at least 10 members concurring. Other cases require at least 5 members in a division. No decision of law may be modified or reversed except by the court sitting in bank. So the Section 3, the qualification of judges. Supreme Court member must be a natural born citizen at least 40 years old and have 10 years of experience as a judge or in a practice of law. Judges of inferior courts must also be natural born citizen and members of the Philippine Bar. The Section 4 talks about appointment of judges. So, members of the Supreme Court and judges of inferior courts are appointed by the President. Section 5, powers of the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court has original jurisdiction over cases involving ambassadors, public ministers, consuls, and petitions for rights of certiorari prohibition, mandamus, quo warranto, and habeas corpus. It reviews final judgment in cases related to constitutionality of laws, taxes, jurisdictions of inferior courts, and serious criminal cases. Example, death, or life imprisonment. It can also assign temporary judges to other stations, order a change of trial venue, and promulgate rules for court procedures. So now, the section 6 talks about administrative supervision. The Supreme Court has administrative supervision over all courts and their personnel. The section 7 talks about tenure and discipline of judges. Supreme Court members and the inferior court judges hold office for good behavior until they reach 70 years old or become incapacitated. The Supreme Court can discipline and with at least 8 votes dismiss inferior court judges. The section 8 talks about decision-making process. Decision of the Supreme Court are reached through consultation before opinions are written. Dissenting members must state their reasons. This practice applies to inferior collegiate courts as well. So the section 9 talks about court decision. Decisions by courts of record must clearly state the facts and the laws behind them. The rules of court govern the promulgation of resolutions. The section 10 talks about salaries. So the salaries of the Chief Justice, Associate Justices, and judges of inferior courts are fixed by law and cannot be reduced during their tenure. So the Chief Justice receives 75,000 pesos annually, and each Associate Justice receives 60,000 pesos until otherwise provided by the law. So the section 11 time limits for decision. The Supreme Court must decide cases within 18 months, with inferior collegiate courts given 12 months and other inferior court 3 months. So if no decision is made within the set time, the case is affirmed or dismissed depending on the nature of the case. So now the section 10 talks about salaries. The salaries of the Chief Justice, Associate Justices, and judges of inferior courts are fixed by law and cannot be reduced during their tenure. So the Chief Justice receives 75 pesos annually, and each Associate Justice receives 60,000 pesos until otherwise provided by the law. Section 11 time limits for decision. So the Supreme Court must decide cases within 18 months, with inferior collegiate courts given 12 months and other inferior courts 3 months. If no decision is made within the set time, the case is affirmed or dismissed depending on the nature of the case. So the section 12 talks about annual report. So annual report, the Supreme Court must submit an annual report on the judiciary's activities to the President, Prime Minister, and Batasang Pambansa within 30 days from the beginning of each regular session. So that's the section 10 talks about. Now let's proceed to the 1976 amendments of to the 1973 Philippine Constitution. So in 1976, President Ferdinand Marcos proposed significant amendments to the 1973 Philippine Constitution through Presidential Decree number 1033. So which called for a national referendum of October 16, 1966. So the referendum sought to address key issues, including the continuation of martial law and the formation of a new legislative body to replace the existing interim National Assembly. So here are the key points from the proposed amendment. So the first one is continuation of martial law. So the first question in the referendum asked the people whether they wanted martial law to continue. This was a crucial decision as martial law had been in effect since 1972, giving the president sweeping powers. So the second one is creation of the interim Batasang Pambansa. The second question sought public approval for constitutional amendment to replace the existing interim National Assembly with the interim Batasang Pambansa. This new legislative body would have the maximum of 120 members, including elected representatives from different regions of the country, sectoral representatives elected by age and sector with at least 18 years old, and appointed members from the cabinet. So the third one, powers of the interim Batasang Pambansa, which means the interim Batasang Pambansa would have similar powers and responsibilities as the previous National Assembly, though it would not hold the power provided in Article 8, Section 14 of the Constitution. So the fourth one is the presidency and the prime ministerial rules. Upon the election and selection of the interim Batasang Pambansa, the president would serve the prime minister, continuing to hold all existing powers even after Batasang Pambansa was organized. So the fifth one is the presidential legislative powers. The president would continue to exercise legislative powers until martial law was lifted, emphasizing his central role in governance. So the sixth one is emergency powers. In cases of emergency or when the Batasang Pambansa was unable to act, the president or the prime minister could issue decrees or letters of instructions which would become law by passing the actual legislative process. So in conclusion, the result of the referendum were announced by the proclamation number 1595 on October 27, 1976, confirming the people's approval of these constitutional changes, effectively empowering Marcos to continue his rule under martial law and expand his control over the legislative and executive branches. And I guess that's all of my report. Thank you.